Welcome to the Castle of Spirits, True Ghost Stories podcast. Brought to you by castleofspirits.com, where you can read 4,600 and plus true ghost stories submitted by listeners and readers of the website just like you. Today's podcast episode is special.
What's so special about it?
Well, we decided to mix things up this week. Jane?
Oh, yeah, that's me. I'm Jane. I'm the ghost keeper.
Oh, hi, and I'm Ghost Keeper Vince. Ghost Peeper. Wow, we're off to a really good start today.
This is a rated PG show, but it almost got an R rating right there.
And speaking of our ratings, we're going to be talking about one of our favorite subjects today. That topic being the life and the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe.
That's right.
I have been an Edgar Allan Poe fan. You know, I was thinking about it in preparation for the show, and I was wondering if I could remember when it was that I first became aware of the name Edgar Allan Poe.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say when that was.
No, me either. I think he's so, embedded in the zeitgeist that, you don't remember the first time you heard the name or, became aware of the person. There's a lot of people like that.
Like David Bowie or Rod Serling. They were always there.
Mm-hmm.
A name that I would pick up on occasionally. And then I looked into it and I said, hey, I like this thing.
Yep.
And I think that maybe my attraction to the spooky was what maybe led me to the discovery of Edgar Allan Poe.
So I think my earliest remembered introduction to Edgar Allan Poe was actually a Jim Reeves song.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. My grandparents used to listen to Jim Reeves a lot. So I kind of grew up listening to Jim Reeves. And he has it's kind of a spoken word musical piece that is basically him reading the Edgar Allan Poe poem, Annabelle Lee. It's really, really beautiful.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's my I think that's my favorite Poe poem.
Mine is A Dream Within a Dream.
Yeah, that's another good one.
Sorry to interrupt you. Even though what?
Well, I like all of them. I like all his greatest hits.
All the big hits.
All the big hits. Those are my favorites.
Well, why don't we tell those few listeners that we might have who aren't familiar, why don't we tell them a little bit about who Edgar Allan Poe was?
Okay.
So Edgar Allan Poe was born January 19th of 1809, and when he was born, his name was just Edgar Poe. Allan comes in later. And he was a kind of a Renaissance man. He was a writer, a poet, a novelist, a newspaper editor, a literary critic, even a military man. He went to West Point, which he apparently got himself court-martialed so that he could leave. He had kind of a storied past with the military.
Isn't that also, West Point is a setting for that Netflix movie?
Yeah. The pale blue eye. Mm-hmm.
Right.
He's also credited as kind of being the inventor or at least the forefather of like Gothic fiction and Romanticism. But he's also credited as being the inventor of the detective fiction. So Without Edgar Allan Poe, we wouldn't have things like Sherlock Holmes and, everything that's kind of come off of the back of that.
Interesting. And I know that also that one thing that I do know about him is that he was one of the first originators of the short story. Mm. There wasn't a lot of short story writing before him. And I guess at the time it was a new art form.
Yeah, I didn't realize that.
And I also understand that he is now credited for having sort of planted the seeds for what would later become science fiction writing.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people think of kind of H.P. Lovecraft, when thinking about science fiction. But H.P. Lovecraft was born like 40 plus years after Poe died. So Poe is really, one of the kind of founding fathers of science fiction. And Mr. Moon, the castle cat, is on one, and he will not be contained.
You switch on the microphones, and they all come to life, just like the ghosts.
They wake up. So
you hear any bumps? It's not us. It's definitely the animals and the ghosts.
Yes. So shortly after Poe was born, his mother died, and then his father kind of 86'd. He took off. And so Poe went to the Allan family, where he was kind of fostered until he became an adult. And that's where the name Allan comes from. But they never actually legally adopted him.
Right. So his middle name isn't Allan. It's Allan Poe is sort of like his hyphenated,
Yeah.
non-hyphenated last name.
Not hyphenated. Yeah.
Is it true that he had a really tumultuous relationship with his foster father, mainly because Edgar Allan Poe had a gambling problem?
Yeah, he was a gambler. And
Mr. Allan was apparently well-to-do. He had a lot of money, but he was just like, I don't have all the money in the world to pay off your gambling debts.
Yeah. Well, and I read, I don't know, he must have done some serious gambling, because I read somewhere, I think it might have been in the Wikipedia article, and any of these articles we talk about will be linked in the show notes, so you can get to him there. But he was willed or given as a gift some land, Poe was, and it amounted to, in today's money, something like $19 million worth of land, but he died penniless. So, he must have had just a rip-roaring gambling problem.
Either that or he didn't know how to convert the land into cash
I guess.
To put on the gambling table. Yeah.
I never read what happened to that land, just that he obtained it.
Now, as far as Edgar Allan Poe goes, he wrote a lot
Pogos?
The Pogos of Edgar Allan Poe.
The Pogo sticks.
He wrote a lot about loss, and a lot of his... There's a recurring theme of the death of a woman, of a beautiful woman, and of course that must have started with his mother.
Yeah, and in particular, the death of a woman through tuberculosis. There were several, women who he loved in his life who died of tuberculosis or something similar. His mother, his first wife, it was a little problematic, but let's just say that's how it was done back in the day. He married his 13-year-old first cousin when he was 26, Virginia Clem, and she died of tuberculosis 11 years later. Yeah, there was a lot of death of women that he loved in his life, and so much of that is reflected in his stories and poetry.
Well, one thing I did learn about him that I didn't know was that he had a relationship with somebody when he was 15 or 16. It's like a girlfriend.
Yeah.
And her name was Sarah Elmire Royster Shelton. But he went away to college.
Yeah.
And while he was away at college, she got married to somebody else. And she had children and all that stuff. And, it's indicated that it was something he never really got over.
Though they did reconnect later in life.
Yeah, I read that he came back into her life in 1848. Now, we're talking a year before Poe's death. This was after her husband had died and after his wife, Virginia Clem, had died. Now, he wanted to get married. She didn't. She resisted. But it's said that Sarah was a huge influence on Poe's work and that she herself may have inspired not only The Raven, but also Annabel Lee. Now, speaking of Poe's childhood and his life, it's notable that pretty much every place that he ever lived is now some sort of a museum or a designated historical site. One of those places, that the earliest surviving home in which he lived was at 203 North Amity Street in Baltimore. So this place, this Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum, I've never heard anything about any of these places being haunted necessarily. But when I was perusing through the castle, doing a little bit of cleaning here and a little bit of cleaning there, and searching of the name Edgar Allan Poe, I stumbled upon a story that we have in the archive.
Oh, really?
And that story is called Happy Birthday, Mr. Poe. It was submitted in July of 2007. By somebody named Rob Disney Coker in North Carolina. This story references that Amity Street address in Baltimore and the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum. So I thought I'd read that to you and let you know what I found very interesting in this story.
Please do.
The story takes place in Baltimore, Maryland on January 19th, 1977, also Edgar Allan Poe's birthday. And it goes like this. Having worked as a police officer for 30 years, I have been involved in many incidents that would make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. The story I'm about to impart is one of them, and it has never been told. I remember it now as clearly as I did 30 years ago. I was working the midnight shift in an area of West Baltimore where most consider it too dangerous to walk the streets after dark. Within my post, a 3-square block area of low-rise projects and high-rises, there stands a rather insignificant house among the flotsam and jetsam of society. There, listed on the Register of Historic Places in America, is 221 North Amity Street, Baltimore, Maryland. Now, this address may mean nothing to those unfamiliar with the stories of the macabre, but to those familiar with The Telltale Heart, The Raven, and The Pit and the Pendulum, this tiny, uninhabited dwelling once warmed the hands and the feet of one of the greatest poets and short story essayists who ever placed a quill to paper. The home of Edgar Allan Poe stands as it did many years ago, restored to its original condition, a small gem among the degradation of poverty and crime. The only room in the 2-story dwelling that seemed inhabited at one time was a very small closet of a room on the 2nd floor, which was no bigger than a jail cell. Against the wall stood an old writing desk and chair, much as it had during Poe's time. Now, every year on Mr. Poe's birthday, a group of Poe enthusiasts gather at his grave at the Westminster Cemetery located on Fayette Street, which is approximately an 8-block walk from Amity Street. Each year, a bottle of fine brandy is placed on his tombstone, and stories are told until well after 5 in the morning. Somehow, this bottle of brandy, even under close observation by individuals posted at the grave, will disappear without a trace. Year after year, larger and larger groups would gather on his birthday and place a bottle of brandy on his grave, and every year the same result. No one knew who surreptitiously removed the bottle of brandy. Now, on the night in question 30 years ago, January 19th, 1977, I was patrolling my post and I received a call for lights flickering inside the Poe house. As I pulled up in front, I could see that there was indeed an illumination from a room on the 2nd floor, the room which contained the only piece of furniture in the house, Poe's writing desk. As I exited my patrol car, I noticed that the street was remarkably quiet for 5 a.m. Not even the local drunkards or drug addicts stirred, as they usually did upon the arrival of a police car. To my surprise, the front door of the 221 North Amity Street house was unlocked, and as I entered, I could hear the telltale buzzing sound of having just activated the intrusion alarm. As I glanced around the downstairs, I could see a dim illumination coming from the upstairs, as though from an oil lamp or a candle. Now, reader, I have checked the perimeter of this house dozens of times, having been dispatched there for the intrusion alarm, but on those occasions I found nothing disturbed or out of the ordinary until this night. I thought it odd that the front door was unlocked, since a historical society does tours by appointment only and always locks up and sets the alarm when they leave. I continued checking the house, and I found nothing out of the ordinary except an oil lamp that was burning dimly on Mr. Poe's writing desk. I did think this was very odd, so I called for a canine dog and the person on call from the Historical Society. Perhaps, I thought, some kids had lit the lamp and were scared off. A couple of minutes later, the canine unit arrived and checked the building's perimeter, as I did, with negative results. As we were finishing up our building search inside, we were greeted by a rather small, eccentric-looking fellow, neatly dressed, carrying a small satchel. He was very morose and extremely articulate. He inquired if everything was in order with the property. We informed him of our findings and asked him to check to see if anything was disturbed. The canine handler and I stood outside on the sidewalk and waited for the gentleman to return. Several minutes elapsed, and we decided to ask if he was okay. There was no response. We re-entered the house along with the canine, and upon reaching the top of the stairs, we discovered that the canine dog, a German shepherd named Duke, would not go any farther. Duke was one of those dogs that had no fear. Even his handler advised other cops to steer clear when they arrived on the scene. This time, the canine handler ordered his companion to seek, but Duke practically cowered. The fellow that had greeted us was nowhere in sight. And then, as I turned around, there on the desk, where the oil lamp still burned, was a half-full bottle of fine brandy and an empty satchel that was not there on our earlier inspection. We just looked at each other and then heard someone downstairs call up to us. It was the night reference from the Historical Society, a young man I recognized from prior calls. He inquired if everything was all right. He could see by the looks on our faces and the demeanor of Duke that not all was okay. By this time, he had turned on the electric lights in the house, and as we walked to the stairs once again, I could smell a faint, smoky odor and noticed that the oil lamp was no longer burning and the bottle of brandy and the satchel were no longer on the writing desk. The young man asked if we had lit the lamp, and as I prepared to answer him, I could see there on the desk a ring, a wet mark where the half-filled bottle of brandy had sat. The young man from the Historical Society looked at our faces, grinned, and simply said, "I see you have interrupted Mr. Poe's birthday celebration. You need to come back on October 7th and celebrate his death. He'll be glad to see you again." Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, and died in Baltimore, Maryland on October 7th, 1849. The cause of death is still undetermined. And that was written by Rob Disney Coker from North Carolina, USA, in July of 2007. Happy birthday, Mr. Poe. A true ghost story account of a guy who apparently had a run-in with the ghost of Edgar Allan Poe, or maybe a creepy imitator.
Either way, it was spooky and it was good.
Now, let me ask you a question. If you found yourself at this former residence of Edgar Allan Poe, and some dude walked up to you and said, "Is everything okay here?" and it was Edgar Allan Poe, don't you think you'd recognize him?
Yeah, but you're not really looking for him at that point. You're a cop who's got a job to do, and you wouldn't be looking for a ghost. You wouldn't just see somebody who looks like him and be like, "Oh, it's his ghost." You'd say, "Wow, this guy really likes Edgar Allan Poe, and he works here."
Maybe the guy was a Poe nerd, or maybe he was also an aspiring writer. Edgar Allan Poe inspired quite a few people to become writers. I think one of them might have been Stephen King.
I think one of them might have been you.
Maybe, maybe so. But I was reading about him and I didn't know a lot of these details about his life. I knew he was a writer. I knew he was a poet. I knew from, the pale blue eye that he'd been in the military at least a little bit. But when I looked at his writing career, I was fascinated to learn that Edgar Allan Poe self-published his first collection of poetry.
Wasn't it something crazy, like only 50 copies were ever even made? I would love to get my hands on one of those 50 copies.
It was around the time he was 18. It was a 40-page collection of poetry called Tamerlane and Other Poems. You can find it, obviously, reprinted.
Yeah.
But only 50 copies were made. He paid a printer to print this up. He didn't even put his name on it, though.
Yeah, it was, didn't it say a Bostonian or something? A
Bostonian, exactly. And as somebody myself who has worked with self-publishing in the past.
And the current.
And currently, and, kind of guides people through self-publishing or assisted publishing, I found that very interesting, very fascinating that you can count Edgar Allan Poe as probably one of the most successfully self-published authors in history.
Yeah.
And in fact, he did get a lot of short stories published here and there.
Yeah, in different magazines and papers.
Right.
Typically anonymously.
Yeah. And in 1831, he released a volume of poems that was simply called Poems. And this is the first and earliest example of crowdfunding that I've ever heard of. I'm sure it's existed long before that.
Yeah.
But it was financed with the help from his fellow cadets at West Point.
Yeah, I read that.
These guys, a lot of them donated like 75 cents. That was the going bid, I guess. and they raised $170.
And that 75 cents, that had to have been a good amount for them to put up, because I remember reading that while he was at West Point, he was paid $5 a month. So, if a lot of them were being paid roughly $5 a month, 75 cents, that, they put forth some money to him.
And he was no shrinking violet either, apparently.
Right.
Apparently, he tooted his own horn. He got these guys interested because he had gotten them to like his writing by writing like satirical limerick type poetry about the commanding officers at West Point. So all these guys loved him because he was kind of a comedian and he was a brilliant writer. Mm. Could you imagine having Edgar Allan Poe come up to you and say, "Hey, check this out, what I just wrote."
And it's making fun of your commander.
Right. And you're, through the lens of history, you'd be like, what are you wasting your time with this for?
Right.
But my God, to be one of those people, how fascinating must that have been? But I really love that he crowdfunded the publication of that collection of poems. We talked about how he worked as an editor in certain publications. He got some stories published, and he came to the attention of a guy who introduced him around and got him a job at this Southern Literary Messenger. But Poe was fired for showing up drunk. Like you do, if you show up drunk, you get fired.
Yeah.
But he later managed to get himself rehired, promising that he'd do better this time. And in that time is where, through that publication, that's where he got a lot of poems published of his own. Plus, he wrote book critiques and book reviews and, other stories in the newspaper.
And made some enemies.
He did.
By being a scathing critic.
And it reminds me a little bit of Ambrose Bierce did the same thing, didn't he?
Yeah, I think so.
Because the thing is, I think that what happens is that these guys are in possession of such incredible, unearthly talent that they can just look at somebody's writing and just knock it over and say, this is a piece of garbage.
Yeah.
Because somebody with such a gift like Edgar Allan Poe would probably be a real snob.
Yeah,
he was probably not an awesome guy.
I don't know if I would go that far. It sounds like everybody who knew him in his personal life. I'm not talking about peripherally, like people that he criticized their writing, but everybody who knew him in his personal life, save for John Allen, really seemed to like him.
Yeah.
Okay. He seemed like he was kind of a ladies' man, and, he had those friends at West Point giving up a substantial part of their pay to help finance his book. So I haven't read that he was really too much of a douche canoe. to use a turn of phrase from Poe's time.
Ladies and gentlemen, the verdict is in. Edgar Allan Poe is not, in fact, a douche canoe.
That's right. And of course, that's one of the other big hits by the modern lovers. That Edgar Allan Poe was never called a douche canoe. It has to rhyme with Poe.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that song.
Yeah, it's kind of it was a minor hit. Yeah.
Interesting. I'll have to check that out when we're done here. Mm-hmm. Did you know that Edgar Allan Poe was interested also in politics?
I did not.
I'm not talking about just like a passing interest, like, hey, I'm going to vote for this guy.
But, there's some voting in his future.
That's coming. That's coming. Poe attempted to get a position in the administration of President John Tyler.
Really? Speechwriter?
Who was a member of, can you imagine a speech?
That would be pretty legit. And my speechwriter, Edgar Allan Poe. All of his speeches are slightly macabre.
Once upon an afternoon dreary.
417 midnight drearies ago.
But anyway, he wanted to get appointed to the U.S. Custom House in Philadelphia. He apparently knew President Tyler's son, but Poe failed to show up for the meeting to discuss the appointment, so he didn't get the job. I mean, maybe it was for the best.
Either he really didn't want it,
or he wanted it so bad.
He was out. Yeah, he wanted it so bad. He was out celebrating that he had an appointment, and then overslept the alarm the next day.
He wakes up and he's like, "Oh my God, I did it again." Now, could you imagine that you're like, "Oh God, I actually got an interview. I don't want this job." Look, I'll be right back. I'm going down to the bar.
Yeah. And he famously could not hold his liquor. So he goes
apparently
down
he
and
was-
has one little glass of wine and he's tanked for
Well,
3 days.
He looked like a little guy.
He did look like a little guy.
Yeah. Little guys can't, I mean, but you would think after like kind of a lifetime of boozing it up that you'd, develop
I don't know
a
that he did
tolerance.
have a lifetime of boozing it up. I think that's one of the fallacies that kind of came about from his obituary, which we'll talk about later as well. I think that he did have a problem with alcohol in that I've read that they believe that he might have been mildly allergic and that even small amounts of alcohol would affect him very, very drastically, and it would take him days to recover. It wasn't that he was out boozing it up. It was that if he had some, it knocked him around.
Okay, now that kind of brings me to wanting to discuss something, that we're kind of all here to listen and learn a little bit about. What exactly happened with his death? First, he was only 40 years old.
Yep.
And if you're saying he wasn't like a real hardcore alcoholic, like they say, he was lightweight.
Yeah.
So it wasn't necessarily that he drank himself to, or that he died of cirrhosis of the liver or something.
Well,
what happened?
Nobody really knows. There's a lot of mystery around it. There are a ton of theories. If you just crawl the Google, you're going to find so many theories, and some of them are so ridiculous. And then the attending doctor had these stupid theories that, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but seriously, I think that he was up in the night. But then also there was the obituary written by a man, Griswold. What was his first
Rufus
name?
Griswold.
Rufus Griswold, who...
basically an enemy.
Yeah, they were like
Poe's.
mortal enemies. So he writes this horrible review talking about how he was a womanizer and a drunk.
Yeah.
And an obituary. A womanizer and a drunk and a drug addict and, all of these horrible things. And that was kind of the final word. And I think a lot of those lies have become misconceptions that have followed the Poe story around for a long time.
The Poe myth.
Exactly.
Now, for those who are not aware, here's how it went down. On October 3rd of 1849, he was found semi-conscious. It was in Baltimore. According to this guy, Joseph Walker, who found him, his statement to the police was that he found Poe in great distress and in need of immediate assistance. Poe was taken to the Washington Medical College, where he died on Sunday, October 7th, 5 days later, 5 o'clock in the morning, at the age of 40. Poe wasn't coherent enough for long enough to explain what the hell happened to him.
Right.
Surely they were asking him, dude, what happened to you? Tell us what happened. He could not. The only thing they could get out of him was he kept repeatedly calling out the name Reynolds.
And they have no idea who that would have been to
No
this
idea
day.
at all.
There's no clue who that was.
The attending physician claimed that Poe's last words were, "Lord help my poor soul."
Yeah.
But that doesn't sound like exactly the words of a brilliant poet. You'd think that he would say something.
Yeah. It sounds a little melodramatic. It, sounds like somebody who was trying to capitalize off of the fame of their patient.
Right. All of the relevant medical records are lost. They don't even
including
have
his death certificate.
They don't even have a death certificate.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. I remember hearing things about the doctor who attended to him, like trying to fancy up a lot of the aspects of his death. Like even saying, well, he died at 5 a.m., but maybe we'll write down like midnight. Like midnight sounds...
Once upon a midnight dreary.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It sounds creepy or whatever. But I guess on his death certificate, they put down that he died of phrenitis, which is basically like swelling of the brain. And so because he had swelling of the brain and he was confused and, things like that, the doctor's all, oh, well, I think he died of rabies.
Rabies.
Rabies. That's one of the It's one of the big theories that people point to.
Did a lot of people die of rabies back then? I guess
I don't know, but even though he didn't appear to have any kind of bite wounds on him anywhere.
And he wasn't acting all Cujo.
No, one of the other symptoms of rabies is, I think this is just creepy. It sounds like something out of a Stephen King novel to me. One of the symptoms of rabies is hydrophobia. So people who have rabies and are dying of rabies, they become like phobic of water. But it's well documented that Poe was drinking water, like a lot of water in the hospital. So he was definitely not hydrophobic.
Oh, okay.
So Vince, one thing that you didn't mention that happened leading up to Poe's death that I think is worth mentioning now, because it will figure into at least one of the theories, is that on September 27th, he was traveling from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia to do an editing job, and he never made it to Philadelphia. So he's the most famous writer in America at the time, and he's completely disappeared. He was completely gone. Nobody knew where he was until Joseph Walker found him in that gutter. And so we'll come back to that. That's part of the mystery, where he was during that time. But before we dig too deep into any of these theories, I would like to read a short story for you, a Poe short story.
Oh, reading time.
Mm-hmm. And I am reading out of a physical book. Let's see if you can hear. We all know how I like.
Is that what that thing is?
I do like a physical book. Over an ebook, I'll take it.
Looks like a really thick, weird-looking tablet of some sort.
Okay. So this story is called The Oval Portrait. Are you familiar with this story, Vince?
I am indeed.
You are?
I'm familiar with the title, but I don't remember what the hell it was about.
Oh, okay.
So I'm interested in hearing this.
All right. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less, in fact, than the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks, which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary. In these paintings, my incipient delirium, perhaps, had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood at the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found among the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Long, long I read, and devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent, even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments, I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright, I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favorite heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed in Moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself, but it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance, which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all could it have been that my fancy, shaken from its half-slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained, for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute lifelikeness of expression, which at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabrum in its former position, the cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view. I saw eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, and evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art. She, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cheering all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day, and he was a passionate and wild and moody man who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see that the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from the canvas rarely, even to regard the countenance of his wife, and he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to do save one brush upon the mouth and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp, and then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid, and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. 1842. And that was The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe.
Mr. Poe had a way with words.
I love that story so much.
It's very lyrical.
Yeah, everything he did was, it really had this lyrical quality to it. You could almost hear how it would sound being put to some kind of music, or, being spoken in a Shakespearean type, monologue-y way.
Or his own Virginia drawl.
Do you think Poe had a Virginia drawl?
That's certainly the way that he was depicted in
The
Pale Blue Dot. What's it called? The Pale Blue Eye.
I like to think he was probably a little more Baltimore. Oh, interestingly, I did not know this, probably because I'm not a football person. I don't have anything to do with, sports, but there's a football team called the Baltimore Ravens.
Well, now I like football.
No, I don't like football.
Oh, no?
Mm-mm.
Are they any good, the team?
I don't know.
Well, I guess we'll just have to start watching football to find out.
No.
Just watch movies and stuff about Poe.
Yep.
Remember that movie with John Cusack playing Poe? What was that all about?
I don't know. I don't want to talk about it.
Okay.
I don't remember anything about it except that it was awful. Come at me, if you will. I'm probably the only person on the planet who disliked it, but I did not enjoy it.
Speaking of movies, okay, I have a little bit of trivia here for you.
Oh, it's for me or for them?
It's Edgar Allan Poe trivia for you and for the listener.
All right.
I bet you somebody knows this.
Okay.
Now, we know that Edgar Allan Poe has inspired hundreds, thousands of filmmakers with his work. There's one famous movie star, who's always wanted to make an Edgar Allan Poe biopic.
Oh, yeah?
And I'm going to give you a quote about this project, this dream project that this person has had. And I want you to try and guess who the celebrity is that carries this lifelong passion for Edgar Allan Poe's story.
Okay.
The quote goes, "The first serious screenplay I ever wrote was about the great writer Edgar Allan Poe. At one time, I had aspirations to play him, but I realized I wasn't really right for the part. Maybe someday I'll direct, who knows? I would hate myself if I didn't continue it, at least to the best of my ability, and try to see it actually come to fruition. To be able to go out there and say, I accomplished it. It may have taken 45 or 50 years, but it's done. That's what I'm working on. It's been one of the great challenges of my life, you know."
Oh, no. What, the way you said it, It has to be Stallone.
Yes.
Really?
Sylvester Stallone he's had this screenplay that he calls Poe, and it was something that he's been wanting to do for like you said, 50 years. But
Interesting.
It's never going to happen. I mean, first of all, he's way too old to play Poe now. But even back in the old days, he would have had to have lost like 50 pounds.
Well,
and
Poe was Irish. He was a little Irish guy.
Right.
He was not a large Italian man.
Once upon a midnight drew, you know. Hey, yo, Bernice. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting bit of trivia, but apparently that was from an Instagram video that he posted in 2019 where he's still talking about doing this.
Wow.
And I mean, that was 5 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just would like to be a little birdie or a birdie person that can pop into his life and shake him by the shoulders and say, dude, you're almost 80.
Yeah.
Don't stop making action flicks and do the Poe thing.
Mm-hmm.
But
just get it out. The people need it.
Yeah, we need the. I mean, I'm already envisioning Poe carrying a machine gun or something like that. I don't like that, but we'll see what happens.
That puts a whole different spin on the Telltale Heart. So, should we talk about some of the theories?
I really need to know what happened to Edgar Allan Poe. I really need to know how he died. What this is. Let me tell you something. This is the sort of the idea that I've always had that happened to him.
Okay, let's hear it.
He was walking along the street. Okay, he was staggering down the street, and he got mugged. Mm-hmm. And maybe he put up a fight. Maybe he said something really scathing to one of the people, like, your mother was and somebody clocked him on the head and took his money.
All right. Well, let's keep all of the facts, okay? And let's compare the facts to the theories. So the facts are just, the bullet point facts. He had disappeared for 5 days before he was found in the gutter. He was wearing someone else's clothes. Edgar Allan Poe was known for being quite the dapper dresser. He was a little bit kind of flamboyant in his dress. He liked to look the best, right? He was wearing kind of grubby clothes that were not his. He was wearing some weird like straw hat. He was drunk. He had been beaten. And so those are the facts that we have, that just the basic quick facts. So to say he was mugged in the street, maybe he had just stumbled out of the horse you rode in on, which was the bar that he was outside. Isn't that what it was called? And the horse you rode in on, something like that.
And the horse you rode in on. Oh, God, that's a great name.
It's such a great bar name. So he was outside of that bar. So maybe he had had a drink, gotten in a fight with some people. They beat him, hence the swelling of the brain, falling down, dying in the gutter. But where did the clothes and the hat come from? And where was he for the last 5 days?
I know.
Oh, okay. Let's hear it.
I'm just going to say it, alien abduction.
Okay. So
when aliens abduct people, there have been stories, there have been accounts of people who are placed back in their beds and their clothes are kind of backwards because they've been redressed by these alien forms who don't know anything about how clothes fit on humans. And like their underwear are backwards with the zippers on the other side. And maybe they just got
your underwear has zippers on it?
Okay. Let's not talk about that.
Well, we're not going to let Vince Vaughn participate in that conversation anymore. So, no aliens. So mugging is definitely one of the theories, that he was mugged and beaten to death. Let's go back to the rabies thing. I think that the attending doctor was kind of a cuckoo bird who, from everything I can read, it sounds like he was trying to kind of insert himself in the story. You know what I mean? Let's give him a fanciful time of death. Let's just give him some weird, he died of rabies.
Now, I also heard though I read that the doctor did not know who he was treating.
Yeah, he kept calling him EP. And then they're like, yeah, is that Edgar Poe? Yeah, he's kind of famous. Oh, he died at midnight.
Oh.
Yeah. So rabies, we've talked about a little bit. I do not buy the rabies theory. If you buy the rabies theory, I would love to hear why. Please send me a message. I'm open to anyone changing my mind. I have my theory that I feel like is the most reasonable, but I'm open to others. So I'm scrolling through this Smithsonian Magazine article, which is linked in the show notes, and it's got, I think it's 10 theories, and some of them I feel like are a little bit, there's like a Venn diagram here of, theories, and most of them overlap. So let's just pick another one. Alcohol, they say, is one of the theories. Now, Edgar Allan Poe had his problems with alcohol in the past, like we talked about, but he also had long spans in his life where he didn't drink. And shortly before his death, like within months of his death, he actually had joined the temperance movement, which, was kind of one of the things that ended up leading to the American prohibition of alcohol.
Was that like an early AA or something?
No, it was basically just like, don't drink because God says not to.
Oh.
That's an oversimplification, but it was kind of a movement of people, saying alcohol is bad and we don't want you to do it and we don't want it in our towns and things like that.
Fanatics.
Very, very puritanical. But yeah, so he was a member of the temperance movement. And now that's not to say that he couldn't, backslide and dip into the alcohol again. And like we've already said, a little bit of alcohol went a real long way with Poe. So I don't think it's fair to say that he died from alcohol. Like he didn't die of cirrhosis of the liver, or he could have had a drink, gotten in a fight, fallen down, hit his head, whatever. But I do believe that alcohol did play a part in his death, and we will come back to that.
Yeah, I think it was probably a contributing factor.
Yes.
If not the reason.
Different things that I think are kind of reaches, because none of them make you disappear for 5 days and put on somebody else's shabby clothing, such as carbon monoxide and heavy metal poisoning. Heavy metal poisoning could make you go a little crazy. Mercury was commonly used in medicines in the 1800s, so it's possible that he did have some mercury in his system, but from what I could see, tests done on him after he had died didn't show like a ridiculous amount of mercury, just some, which could have been in laxatives of the day.
Ew.
Yeah. So a brain tumor. So there's this story that when they exhumed his grave, because he was kind of buried unceremoniously, just like, here's a hole, put him in it, bye-bye Poe. And then years and years later, they exhumed him to move him to a more permanent spot with a nice memorial stone and all of that. And when they were moving him, his coffin kind of fell apart and his body came out. And one of the guys moving him said, "Oh, there's something rolling around in his head." And the doctors are like, well, it couldn't be his brain because the brain decays first. So it was a brain tumor, probably, because a brain tumor would calcify after death. And this is brain tumor rolling around in the skull.
What the hell?
I know, really
That's
grim.
Like the ghastliest thing I've ever heard.
Super grim. But remember, Vince, we watched that show a few years ago about H.H. Holmes. Remember when they dug down into the coffin and they found his skull, and there was like a little ball rolling around in his skull, remember? And they said, "Oh, it's like his mummified, shrunken brain." So I think that is a possible thing. It sounds to me like that's a thing that happens. So I don't know that something rolling around in his brain, in his skull, I don't think I buy that means definitively that it was a brain tumor. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that seems like a bit of a reach.
Yeah. And the flu is another theory on here. The flu doesn't get you drunk. The flu doesn't beat you up. It doesn't make you disappear for 5 days. It doesn't put on shabby somebody else's clothes and hat.
Not even Captain Trips.
But he could have had the flu. I mean, he could have had it, but I don't think that it's how he died. Murder And yeah, so apparently.
Where was H.H. Holmes at this time?
Uh,
Probably in his playpen.
Yeah, probably yeah. So the one theory that's on here that I did not mention, and you've probably heard it here and there, if you've ever looked into Poe's death, it's kind of the top theory, one of the primary theory of how he died, and it makes so much sense to me. And it's a thing called cooping. And Vince, had you ever heard of cooping before we started talking about this?
I had not.
Okay. So cooping is a thing that was really popular in the 1800s, and it was a political thing for basically voter fraud. So what cooping entailed, and there is an amazing episode, and I'll link it in the show notes, to a podcast that I love. I love this podcast so much, called Ridiculous History. And they did a full episode on cooping. And I thought, ooh, they're going to mention Edgar Allan Poe. And they didn't. So I was a little disappointed. So I love Ridiculous History a little bit less now because of that.
I don't say that.
Oh, sorry.
They could be listening.
Sorry, Ben and Noel.
Shout out to Ben and Noel.
I'm sure they're not listening, but thank you if you are. Anyway, so cooping was it was pretty horrible. These gangs of thugs.
Obviously hired by political leaders or their organizations.
Or whoever had interests in this person getting into office. It didn't have to be, the person running for office didn't have to have anything to do with it. But so these thugs would go out and they would basically kidnap people, put them in a basement or some other kind of a holding area called a coop, hence the term cooping. They would keep them there for days, where they would beat them and they would force them to drink alcohol. And once they had broken their will a little bit, they would make them go out to these polling stations and vote. And they had to vote for the person that the coopers wanted them to vote for. And when they were done, they would have their clothing changed. They would be put into a disguise, and they would be made to go to the next polling station and vote again and again and again and again and again. And there was one man who said that he was forced to vote at least 16 different times. And, if they refused, they were beaten. Like I said, they were force-fed alcohol because it kind of lowers their inhibitions, makes them a little bit more pliable, to the people, the coopers. And to me, this is what makes the most sense, because Poe had disappeared for 5 days before he was found in the gutter. So he could have been kept in a coop. He was wearing shabby secondhand clothing that he would not have worn. This could be one of the disguises. He was drunk while he was, supporting the temperance movement. It's possible that it was because of this cooping. The bar that we mentioned that he was found outside of was a polling place. He was found on an election night. I don't think it was a presidential election. I think it was a local election, but it was in Baltimore on election night, outside of a polling place. And Baltimore was a real rough place at this time, where cooping was kind of the norm. It was known for this voter fraud tactic. So to me, that is what makes the most sense. He was beaten because he didn't want to comply, force-fed alcohol, made to go out and vote, and then when he couldn't do it anymore, didn't serve their purpose anymore, they let him fall down in the gutter and bid him adieu.
Wow. I kind of hope that's not what happened.
I know.
I'd rather,
it's horrible.
I'd rather have it be, because that's not romantic. I mean, there's nothing romantic about dying from alcoholism.
I'd rather him have a drink and get in a bar fight.
Right, exactly. Yet there is something a little bit more romantic about maybe being so despondent about his life, and that he goes back on the drink and goes on a 5-day bender, and then he goes in this weird adventure where he swaps clothes with somebody, and then he just sort of succumbs. Yeah. But to think that he was victimized like that is not something that I I like to think about.
Yeah, that's kind of a downer to end the episode on, isn't it?
Well, I do have a little something, a little bit of a musical recommendation.
Oh, I know what this is.
If you like music, you've got to check this out. Round about 1987, I was in a record store and I was looking through the records and I came across an Alan Parsons Project album called Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And I was like, what is this? Lo and behold, what I was discovering there was a 1976 album, the first album by Alan Parsons Project. The entire album is inspired by the life and the work, the writing of Edgar Allan Poe.
Mm-hmm.
This thing got released in 1976 and it hit the top 40.
Whoa.
Tales of Mystery and Imagination peaked at number 38 on
Wow.
Billboard's Pop Albums chart. And
It was a different time, wasn't it?
the song The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather peaked at number 37. So, and there's some beautiful songs on there.
Mm-hmm.
So if you like a little bit of Alan Parsons Project, a little bit of maybe progressive rock, electronic 1970s music, you got to check that out. It's going to make your day. So there you go. Edgar Allan Poe inspiring not only writers and people who want to commit voter fraud, but also musicians.
Hey, Vince, maybe we can play just a little snippet of the Nevermore song.
Why, sure.
Yeah.
You're listening to Castle of Spirits FM, and this is the Alan Parsons Project with...
last couple of days. And that definitely helped lift the mood a little bit, Vince. Thank you.
Thanks for that suggestion.
You're welcome. So speaking of music, Vince, I hear the music coming down the hall. It has been very generous with time today. It's let us go on for quite a bit longer than we normally do.
But alas, we have to go feed the ghosts, the spirits that roam the castle. So we want to thank you for listening thus far to this episode of the Castle of Spirits True Ghost Stories podcast.
Yes.
And our Edgar Allan Poe special. Let us know what you thought. Get thee hence to the website. Let us know what you think. You can even call us. The number's there on the website. Drop us a voicemail and tell us what you think.
Yes.
And if you like this podcast, tell a friend.
And if you hate it, tell 2 enemies.
Because that is the way that we achieve world domination through podcast media.
And we might just start cooping our listeners to get more.
Oh no.
Probably not.
Then again,